HP tired of being alone PT6. Harry's spirit was lifted. Since Dumbledore died he'd felt defeated in a lot of ways. He had no idea where to begin looking for the Horcruxes. Well, that wasn't exactly true, he had a few hunches. All last year there were so many important things he should have been asking Dumbledore while they were having their private lessons. Even though he was happy Hermione and Ron were going with him, at the same time he knew that he was responsible for them. If anything happened to them it would be his fault. Taking a deep breath he blocked that from his thoughts. It was the last thing he needed to be thinking about right then. Mad Eye would be there to take him to the Burrow any minute. He walked over to his bed where his rucksack was setting on top of the items he'd discarded. They wouldn't be returning to Hogwarts, so there was no need to take his school robes or Quidditch things or even the majority of his textbooks. In fact, besides the bare essentials like his Muggle clothes, his potion-making kit, the dark arts books Lupin and Sirius had given him for Christmas the year they started the DA, his wand, and invisibility cloak, the only other things he packed were his Christmas gift from Hermione, the picture of the two of them on the bridge, the photo album Hagrid had given him at the end of his first year at Hogwarts, the shard of Sirius's mirror, the locket that had cost Dumbledore his life, and the Marauder's map. After he was sure he had everything he needed, he threw the strap over her shoulder, then felt the breast pocket of his jacket. It seemed odd that everything that meant the most to him he was able to carry on his person. Hedwig and his firebolt had already been sent ahead to the Burrow. After all, Mad Eye was supposed to alongside apparate him to the Burrow if all went to plan, but nothing ever seemed to be that easy. When heard a something smash downstairs, he pulled his wand out of his pocket and headed down. Even though the house of Privet Drive had never felt like home to him, even when he called it this, it still pleased him to no end when he saw the pristine kitchen that his Aunt Petunia was so proud of. Chock full of wizards. The people who she'd spent her entire life, from the time Lily had discovered she was a witch and would be going to Hogwarts, and that Petunia wasn't special, distinguishing herself as completely opposite of. So explain it to me again, Tonks. Exactly how did you pass your stealth test to be an Auror? Harry teased. For once, it was not me, Tonks said, trying to be offended but couldn't help smiling. You're not going anywhere, Mundungus, Mad Eye growled in his gravelly voice. I told you I'm not okay with this at all, Mundungus protested. Are we having a garden party? Harry asked, confused as to why most of the key members of the Order were there along with Fleur, Bill, Fred, George, Hermione, and Ron. If so, I think my aunt keeps the good china and crystal in the cabinet in the formal dining room. Hermione pushed her way through the crowd and wrapped her arms around his neck. I missed you, she said low enough to where he was the only one to hear her. I missed you too, he said back, his hands sinking in her hair as he held her against him, inhaling her sweet scent. The two of you knock it off, you'll make me lose my lunch, Mad Eye growled. Harry pulled back but kept his arm around Hermione. He'd only been away from her for 2 weeks and it had seemed like a lifetime. So exactly what are we doing? Harry asked again. Well, as much fun as a garden party would be, which looking at the garden would be none at all. We are really here to drag you back to the Burrow, George said. I thought Mad Eye was going to dash. Harry started. Change of plans, Potter, Mad Eye said, then went on to explain that Pious Thickness had been taken over by the Death Eaters, be it by being under a spell or that he was acting by his own will. It didn't matter. He'd made it impossible to get Harry out of the house by any direct magical means, meant, fleu, apparition, or porte-clés. Which means that we'll be using brooms, thestrals, and Hagrid's flying motorbike. We've had a dozen houses all connected to the Order put under every measure of protection we could muster, which means they have no idea which house you'll actually be going to. Harry's brow wrinkled. Wouldn't it be kind of obvious which house we're going to once we're up in the air? That's the beauty of this plan, Harry. They won't be expecting 7 Harry Potters in the sky tonight. Mad Eye said, his magical eye whizzing around. Hermione felt Harry's hand tighten on her waist. No, he said, then looked at her. You agreed to this. Hermione opened her mouth to defend her actions when she was cut off by Ron. We all did, he said. It's not like we haven't be risking our necks for this for years. We know the score better than anyone, Harry. Harry shook his head. No, this is different. What you're suggesting, you would be becoming me. I'm not letting anyone else die for me. Harry, everyone here is of age. Lupin pointed out. And exactly what are you going to do against 14 people when you can't use magic? Fred grinned. Hermione sighed. While Harry was distracted, she grabbed a hank of his hair and jerked it out. Bloody hell, Hermione! He growled, rubbing the back of his head while she dropped the hair into Mad Eye's flask. She turned back to him. Harry, you need to relax. The Order has had this planned, all the contingencies, everything is going to be fine, she assured him. Damn it, Hermione! George cursed. Now something bad is going to happen. Nothing bad happens until someone says nothing bad is going to happen. Fred finished. All of you shut your gobs, Mad Eye said when the potion started to bubble. Harry pulled Hermione into the hall away from everyone else and cupped her face. Be careful, he told her. Harry, you really need to stop worrying about me. I'll be fine, she assured him as she looked up at him. Besides, I'll be riding with Kingsley on a thestral. You need to worry about you. He leaned down and kissed her softly. I love you. When we get to the Burrow, we're going to have a long talk, he said sternly. I love you too. She smiled at him before they rejoined the others. As they got ready to take off, Harry had a sense of dread fill his stomach. This wasn't right, something was going to go wrong. Author's note: just putting this out there, there are no owls harmed in the writing of this story. I couldn't bring myself to let Hedwig die. Harry's heart was pounding in his ears when he and Hagrid slammed into the ground outside of the Burrow. His wand still clutched in his shaky hand, he pushed himself off of the ground, his legs wobbly, and ran towards the house. As soon as they were in the air, they were ambushed by Death Eaters. He didn't know what had happened to Hermione and Kingsley. He had a bad feeling he never should have let her do this. If anything happened to her, he quickly pushed the thought from his mind. He refused to think that. Hermione had been with Kingsley, she was safe, he had to be safe. He was almost to the door to the Burrow when it pushed open and Ginny and Mrs. Weasley came out, both with wands drawn. After going through the standard questions to assure he was really Harry Potter, both Ginny and Mrs. Weasley both hugged him so tightly he thought they might have cracked one of his ribs. Nobody else has arrived. It was really more of a statement than a question. The grave look on both of the women's faces said it all. We were attacked as soon as we were in the air. There were Death Eaters everywhere, not the few sentinels like Mad Eye had expected. They knew that I was being moved tonight. Before Molly or Ginny had a chance to say anything else, the door to the kitchen was flung open and Lupin came in, half carrying George, whose face and neck was covered in blood. Mrs. Weasley's face paled when she saw George. She didn't let panic take over her, instead she had Remus lay him on the couch and she and Ginny started cleaning him up. Harry didn't have a chance to ask what had happened before Lupin slammed him against the wall and shoved his wand in his face. What are ya doin'? Let him go, Hagrid snapped at Lupin. What creature sat in the corner the first time that Harry Potter visited my office at Hogwarts? He said, shaking Harry a little. Answer me. Harry's mind was racing. A Grindylow in a tank, wasn't it? He answered as quickly as he could. Lupin let go of Harry, who relaxed against the wall. I'm sorry, he said. What the hell was that all about? Hagrid asked. We were betrayed. I had to be sure. I'm sorry, Harry, he said again. Voldemort knew that you were being moved tonight and the only one who could have told him was directly involved. Harry nodded. I know, but I don't think anyone who was there tonight, none of the Order, would have betrayed me. I think someone might have gotten careless with the date, he didn't know the details. How did he learn which was you? Lupin asked. Harry went on to explain what had happened with Stan Shunpike, how he was only acting under the Imperious curse, so he disarmed him instead of stunning him. It ended up starting a slight argument between him and Lupin, but when they heard a noise outside, both Lupin and Harry headed towards the door, wands ready. Hermione and Kingsley had just arrived at the Burrow, having barely made their portkaya, and were followed shortly after by Mr. Weasley and Fred, who went straight to the house to where George was. As soon as Hermione saw Harry running towards her, she broke away from Kingsley and flung herself in Harry's arms, tears pouring down her cheeks. Harry's arms went around her tightly and he lifted her off of the ground, holding her tightly. Both of them had forgotten about the Ministry protocol completely. "Thank God you're safe," Harry said. "I could say the same," Hermione said, raining kisses all over his face. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Harry said, finally letting her feet touch the ground and lead her towards the house, but kept his arm firmly around her. He wasn't ready to stop touching her. Just Harry and Hermione had been caught up in each other. Mr. Weasley and Fred arrived and went straight to the house. Both were concerned about George. "How's George?" Harry asked when they were inside. Mrs. Weasley was pouring them all a fire whiskey. "He's cleaned up now. I'm not going to be able to do anything about his ear, not when it's been cursed off with dark magic like that," she said. They were silent for a few minutes. Harry could tell that Lupin was trying not to think about Tonks or the fact that she should have been one of the first ones back. "George was hurt?" Hermione asked, breaking the silence. She took a small sip of the whiskey and coughed. "Snape hit him with a sectum sempra," Lupin said. "I wish I could say that I paid him back in full, but I was trying to keep George from falling from the broom." Nothing more was said on the subject. There was a skidding sound outside and Lupin, Harry, and Hermione ran outside. "Remus!" Tonks called. Relief flooded Lupin's face when he saw Tonks. He swept her up into his arms and kissed her hard. "You're all right," Hermione said, hugging Ron. "I'm all right," Ron assured her as Harry clapped his hand on his back. "Ron was great," Tonks said, her arm still wrapped around Lupin, stunned one of the Death Eaters, straight to the head. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him." "Amazing," Harry said, mussing Ron's hair. "Stop it." He smacked Harry's hand away. "Are we the last back?" Harry shook his head. "We're still waiting for Bill and Fleur, Mad Eye, and Mundungus." "Ron!" Ginny exclaimed from the porch. "I'll let Mum and Dad know you're here." "What kept you up? What happened?" Lupin asked Tonks. "That bitch Bellatrix," Tonks said. "She wants me quite as much as she wants Harry. Remus, she was trying very hard to kill me," she said, completely serious. "It held us up and then we'd missed Portkaya and Ron's Aunt Muriel was fussing over us." Lupin's jaw was clenched, but he didn't say anything, just nodded. "I should get back to the Prime Minister. I should have been there an hour ago," Kingsley said. "Let me know once they arrive." "I will," Lupin said. "Why don't we go inside?" asked Harry when he felt Hermione shiver. They didn't get a chance to make it in the door before Mrs. Weasley ran outside and hugged Ron tightly, and then Lupin and Tonks. "Thank you so much, thank you for our sons," she said, her cheeks soaked with tears. "Don't be silly, Molly," Tonks said, hugging her back. Just as they were starting towards the house, they heard the cry of Thestral. They were all relieved when Bill and Fleur dismounted it, though they were windblown they weren't hurt, which was a relief. "Bill! Fleur! Thank God!" Mrs. Weasley cried, running to them and hugging them. Harry noticed right away that while Bill hugged his mom he was bearing bad news. "Mad Eye is dead," he said. Nobody spoke. What Bill was saying was absolutely ludicrous. It wasn't possible for Mad Eye Moody to be dead. The man was missing part of his nose, one of his eyes, and a leg. Of course the tears streaming down Fleur's cheeks as she nodded collaborating Bill's story said it all. Knowing that there wouldn't be anyone else to join them they all turned to go into the house. Bill waited to say any more until they were all inside seated around the table. He finally spoke. "It happened just after we broke out of the circle. Mad Eye and Dung were close by us, they were heading north too. Voldemort he can fly, he went straight for them. Dung panicked, I heard him cry out and Mad Eye tried to stop him but he disapparated. Voldemort's curse hit Mad Eye right between the eyes, he fell backwards off of his broom. There was nothing we could do. We had half a dozen of them on our own tail." Bill's voice broke and he graciously took the glass of fire whiskey Mrs. Weasley had poured him. "Of course you couldn't have done anything," Lupin said. Fred and George walked into the kitchen still laughing from their typical antics. When he saw the grave looks on everyone's faces his smile faded. "Who dash?" He didn't get a chance to finish. "Mad Eye," Mr. Weasley said, "he's dead." There wasn't a dry eye in the room but the hardest hit by the news was Tonks. She had been close to Mad Eye, his favorite and his protege at the Ministry of Magic. With Dumbledore dead and now Mad Eye, it was a hard hit for the Order of Phoenix. Bill, after finishing his fire whiskey, stood up and walked to the sidebar and pulled out another bottle. He filled his own glass and then the glasses of everyone else. "To Mad Eye," he said, lifting his glass. The others followed and they all drank to their fallen friend. Harry wrapped his arm around Hermione, pulling her against him, and squeezed her shoulder gently. "So Mundungus disappeared," he said. It was no secret that he had no love for the fence, not after the way he'd cleared out the house at Grimmauld Place after Sirius died. "I know what you're thinking and I thought it too," Bill said. "They seemed to expect us. Dung couldn't have betrayed us. They didn't know there would be 7 Harrys. It threw them off the moment we appeared. Not to mention Mundungus was the one who suggested that bit of skullduggery. Wouldn't he have told them the essential point? I just think he panicked, simple as that. He didn't want to come and Mad Eye made him, and you know who went straight for them. I would have panicked in his place." Ron couldn't help but grin as he took a drink of his fire whiskey, then looked down at the amber liquid left in the glass. "Yeah, Death Eaters didn't see that coming." They were all scratching their heads. It must have been in a nice change for their BA-. "Ronald Bilious Weasley," Mrs. Weasley screeched, "I will not have you talking like that," she said before boxing his ears. "Mum," Ron grumbled, rubbing his ears. Harry along with everyone else laughed. "Yes, and Zayt's all very good," snapped Fleur, "but still EET does not explain how Z knew we were moving Ari tonight." "Does EET? Somebody must have been careless." She glared around and everyone, her face still tracked with tears. "No," Harry said loudly, standing up, his hands resting on the table, "we're not doing this, we're not pointing fingers. The last thing we need is for us to be divided. Anyone could have let the date slip up. Hell, even I could have. We're not infallible right now. The Death Eaters are probably celebrating, thinking that they've done us in. They've gotten rid of Dumbledore and Mad Eye, not to mention Snape's betrayed us. They think they have the upper hand, and yet alright, they probably do. They think that they're without leadership. We're all going to run away scared and hide. I'll be fucking damned if we let that happen. We are just as united as we were when they were with us. Hell, probably even more, because I know that we're not going to bloody well stand back and let their deaths go without justice." "Well said, Harry," Fred said. "Ear, ear," George said, both he and Fred laughing to themselves. "EY, how come Harry didn't get his ears boxed?" Ron said, still rubbing his ears. I mean, what I said wasn't nearly as bad. Mrs. Weasley raised an eyebrow. You want it again? Harry offered his hand to Hermione. Come on, he said, leading her out of the house. As they made their way out of the house, Hermione picked up a throw off of the back of the couch. Hand in hand, she and Harry headed towards the woods that were still in the perimeter of the burrow. They were quite the only sound in the night was their shoes crunching the grass under their feet. Once the house was out of sight and they were completely alone, Hermione stopped and dropped the blanket on the ground, spreading it out. Her heart was pounding hard enough she was almost certain that Harry could hear it. Harry, stop, she said softly. Harry turned and looked down at her. Are you all right? He asked. Hermione nodded. She took a step towards him and unzipped his jacket, pushing it over his shoulders. She ran her hands up his arms as he wrapped them around her waist, pulling her against him. Are you sure? He asked, his breath heavy. I'm sure, she said before standing up on her tiptoes and kissing him softly. It was all the confirmation Harry needed. He pulled her body firmly against his, groaning at how good her soft body felt against his hard one. His hands roamed the lush curves of her hips, his tongue thrusting slowly into her mouth. Her hands fisted in the front of his shirt and she pushed it up, wanting to feel his skin under her bare hands. She'd never needed anything the way she needed Harry. Before she could push the thought away, a vision of Voldemort flying towards him entered her mind against her will. She'd been trying all night to block it from her mind and so far had luck. Now being with him like this, it had crept up on her, and before she knew it, tears were falling down her cheeks. Harry pulled back when he tasted Hermione's tears. Hermione, he asked, looking down at her. She couldn't say anything as heart-wrenching sobs rocked her body. Baby, it's okay, he said, sitting down on the blanket with her in his arms. It's okay, we're both fine, we're safe, he said, stroking his hair, holding her against him as tight as he possibly could. He hated this, that he'd caused her to cry like this. Hermione, look at me, he said. After a few seconds, Hermione pulled back and looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with tears. He took her hand and pressed it to his heart, which was pounding hard. I'm alive. Hermione didn't say anything as she pushed him back on the blanket, her hand still on his heart, and kissed him again. Harry wasn't sure if he should stop her or not. After all, he didn't want her to do something she regretted because she thought that she had to. He decided to let her have control. They wouldn't do anything she didn't want to. He wrapped her in his arms, pulling her against him, and kept kissing her softly. I love you, Harry, she said, pulling back and looking up at him. I love you too, he said, looking into her eyes, his hand cupping her cheek. Make love to me, she said, looking up at him. Are you sure? He asked. Harry, when do I ever do anything that I'm not sure of? She asked. Harry took that as a yes. He leaned down to kiss her, pushing her jacket over her shoulders and fighting with the buttons of her shirt. Becoming frustrated, he tore the shirt open and groaned when he saw she only wore a silken camisole under it. He slid his hand up her side, cupping her breast through the flimsy material, causing her to grasp. She trailed kisses down the side of his neck, tugging gently on his ear, her hands sliding up the back of his t-shirt. Goose flesh broke out over his skin when her fingertips traced patterns against the sensitive skin of back. Harry leaned down and used his teeth to pull the strap of her camisole down her shoulder before flicking his tongue over the peak of her breast, causing her to gasp and sink her hand in his lush hair. He grinned. He loved the way she responded to her touch. He looked up at her, taking her nipple into his mouth, teasing it gently, his free hand sliding down her flat stomach to the fasten of her jeans. Hermione pushed his hand out of the way and undone her jeans for him. She closed her eyes and gasped when his hand slid inside of them and arched off of the ground. She loved what he was doing to her, the way he was making her feel. Nothing else mattered, not the Horcruxes or Voldemort or that goddamned war. Nothing existed but the two of them in this perfect moment. He groaned when his hand slid into her panties and he felt how wet she was for him. His fingertip pressed against her clit and he teased her gently. He bit back the smug grin at her responses. He knew that Hermione was a virgin, and while he wasn't far from being one himself, the idea of being the only man to ever touch her was appealing. "You're so fucking beautiful like this," he groaned. "Harry." Hermione gasped, looking up at him, watching him as she wiggled against his hand. She felt like a fire was building in her body and she didn't know how much more she could handle. "That's my girl," he groaned, gently sliding his finger into her and teased her clit with his thumb. She threw her head back and screamed his name, her hot cream coating his fingers, her body still trembling in pleasure. Harry let her ride out her orgasm before slowly undressing her and then shedding his own clothes. He came over top of her and kissed her hungrily. "I love you so much, Hermione Granger," he groaned as he pressed the head of his cock against her core and started to slide into her slowly. "Go easy, Harry." She looked up at him, her fingertips sliding down his spine. "I don't want to hurt you." He looked down at her. "I trust you, Harry," she said, leaning up and kissing him softly. That was all the encouragement he needed. Slowly he eased himself inside of her until he reached her hymen and paused, giving her body time to adjust. Hermione knew that he was trying to keep from hurting her, and that meant more to her than anything. She looked up at him, her eyes locking with his beautiful green ones before. She rocked her hips against his, her nails dug into his back as her hymen broke. "Damn it, Hermione!" he half groaned, half scolded. "You didn't want to hurt me," she said, her voice quivering. "So I did it for you." Harry leaned down and kissed her soft, his arms tightening around her. Slowly he pulled out and slid slowly back into her, causing them both to gasp. He claimed her slowly, his hands sliding over her body, his tongue thrusting into her mouth. He'd never felt anything like this when he'd been with Cho. It hadn't been this intense. Hermione's nails bit into his back, her long legs wrapped around him. Before long she was arching off of the ground, screaming his name as she came again, this time with such force that it milked Harry of his own pleasure. He rolled off of her, pulling her across him. He loved this, the intimacy of the moment. He was glad that he hadn't dragged her off to some abandoned part of the castle for some rushed tryst. "I love you," he said, leaning down to kiss her slowly. Hermione moaned softly, kissing him back. "I love you too." "Are you cold?" he asked as the night wind blew over them, causing their already overly sensitive skin to react. "I don't think I'll ever be cold again," she said, looking up at him. "Yeah," he grinned, but still wrapped the end of the blanket around them. "Yeah," she smiled, laying her head on his chest. "I'm not going to move from this spot ever. Voldemort can go bloody well fuck himself." Harry kissed her forehead and laughed as he wrapped his arms around her. "I like that." "Me too," she said, closing her eyes. Harry held Hermione, watching her while she slept. He knew that he should probably wake her and take her back to the house where she could rest more comfortably in her bed. The selfish part of him refused. He didn't want anything to ruin this moment. Besides, he wasn't in the least bit done with her yet. Author's note: I think after Ron interrupted them at Hogwarts this was long time coming, no pun intended. Which I was been a dirty tease, then this was actually planned to happen like this all along. Don't forget to read and review. Harry groaned, his arms tightening around Hermione as he came awake. It took him a few minutes to remember the exact details of what had happened the night before. Even with everything that was going on, it was perfect and nothing would ever change that. He pushed her hair off of the back of her neck and trailed kisses down the smooth skin. Remember exactly how it made her shiver. "Good morning," Hermione moaned softly, turning her head to kiss him softly. "Yes, it is," he said, sliding into her slowly from behind. She closed her eyes and gasped, Harry, we really should be getting back before they noticed we've been gone all night. Harry slid his hands up to cup her soft breast as he pulled out and buried himself inside of her again. I'm sure they already know. Harry, she moaned, leaning back against him, rocking back against him, meeting him stroke for stroke. She knew that she needed to be the responsible one, but when he was touching her and kissing her, she couldn't seem to keep any thoughts in her head. Finally she gave herself over to him. After all, she'd done enough thinking in her life to last several lifetimes. Harry slid his hand between her legs and teased her clit, causing her to tremble. She wrapped her hand around his forearm. She wasn't sure if she was trying to push his hand away or hold it there. Harry, she whimpered. Like that? He asked, biting her shoulder, gently teasing her more as he pulled all of the way out and slammed back into her. Yes, she sobbed as shocks of pleasure shot through her small body. Good, he said, doing it again. It wasn't long before they both came crying out each other's names. Mrs. Weasley was finishing breakfast when Hermione and Harry made it back to the Burrow. Harry had actually expected a lecture from her. After all, it was kind of irresponsible of them to stay all night out in the woods after everything that happened. At the same time, that might have been why she didn't say anything, or possibly the fact that she didn't want to have that conversation with him. Still, it did surprise him when she told them to sit down and served them breakfast. The whole time Hermione kept her eyes on her plate the whole time and was relieved when she was able to leave the table. It wasn't that she was ashamed of what she and Harry had done. Molly Weasley was like a second mother, and she couldn't possibly talk to her about what had happened. It would be odd. She was relieved when she was able to go up to stairs. After a long shower, Hermione came out of the bathroom dressed in a pair of worn jeans that hugged her curves and a loose-fitting, almost sheer white t-shirt. She was drying her hair with a towel as she walked into Ginny's room. "Oh my God. Tell me everything," Ginny said, jumping off of the bed and slamming the door shut. Hermione blinked as she sat down on the bed. "What?" "Well, you and Harry, you were gone all night," she said, then lowered her voice. "Did you and he?" she trailed off, not needing to finish. Hermione's face was bright red. "Ginny, I'm not talking about this, it's private." Ginny's eyes went wide. "Oh wow, how was it?" "Ginny, please," she said. "Fine," she said dramatically. "Keep it all to yourself." Hermione smiled. "It was nice, that's all I'm saying." Ginny giggled. "Wow." After breakfast, Harry went outside to help Ron denome the garden. Fleur's parents were supposed to be in the next day, and Mrs. Weasley was hell-bent on making sure the Burrow was perfect for their guests. "So are you going to pretend like you and Hermione didn't sneak in at breakfast this morning?" "I have no idea what you're talking about, Ron." Harry shrugged as he jerked one of the gnomes up and spun it around and flung it out of the yard. It never failed to amuse him the way they cursed at them. "I told you about Lavender and me," Ron said. "And I never asked you to either," Harry reminded him. "Besides, Hermione is one of your best mates. Do you really think that she would want you to know about something that personal?" Ron thought about it for a few minutes. "I always thought that she and Krum, you know. I mean, they couldn't have been spending all that time in the library. He's a big-time Quidditch star. I mean, Hermione said it herself that Krum was a physical being." Harry was seething. There were very few times that he wanted to literally knock the shit out of his best mate. Right now was one of those times. He flung the gnome he'd been almost choking to death and then turned to his friend. "Ron, do yourself a favor and shut up." Ron looked oblivious. "What's wrong?" "I'm not you. I'm not going to run back to my friends to tell them all the details of what I may or may not have done. See, that's the difference between the two of us. I'm continent. I love Hermione and I have every intention of marrying her when this whole fucking thing is over. Can you say the same about Lavender? I remember you coming to me at Christmas freaking out because she asked what your intentions were with her. Ron opened his mouth to say something and then shut it again before trying once more. I don't know. Exactly. Harry said before walking away. Author's note, sorry about the shortness of this chapter, it kinda went in its own direction. The days at the Burrow leading up to Harry's birthday and Bill and Fleur's wedding were perfect. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that the hands on Mrs. Weasley's clock was pointing to mortal peril and Order members dropping in to deliver information, it was easy to forget that their world was in the middle of a great civil war. It might have been the simple fact that helping prepare the house of the wedding and packing for their trip tied up so much of their time. They hadn't really even had time to think about things. Where Voldemort was, who was he killing, what his plans were. Even at night Harry's thoughts were on other things. Before he knew it, his birthday had arrived. Mrs. Weasley had asked how he wanted to celebrate. After all, it was a special time. Originally he'd said that he didn't want a fuss, but after thinking things over he'd changed his mind. They'd had so much tragedy that a small intimate party might help with morale. He made Mrs. Weasley, Hermione, and Ginny promise not to do anything too over the top. Added to their normal dinner party society, Harry invited Neville, Luna, Dean, and Lavender. The morning of his birthday was like any other day, well, any other day that involved him waking to his scar hurting and the remnants of Voldemort's thoughts plaguing his mind. Of course that was your average Tuesday. Today, however, he was able to use magic upon awaking and constantly throughout the day. The freedom of it was amazing, and he understood Fred and George and their need to use magic for everything after they came of age. After stabbing himself in the eye with glasses, Harry managed to dress himself while Ron sat in the corner laughing his ass off at him. Here's your present, Ron said, shoving a box in Harry's hands. Harry ripped open the packaging and stared at the contents blankly. It's a book. You haven't done some ass backwards charms and switched brains with Hermione, have you? He pulled it out, tossing the wrappings aside, and read the title. Never mind, you thought I needed this because, he asked, flipping it around so that the Busta Witch on the front was winking and blowing kisses at Ron. It's not just any book, Ron said, taking the copy of 12 Fail-Safe Ways to Charm Witches from Harry. It explains everything you need to know about girls. I was just thinking, maybe if you would have had this last year you would have been able to deal with Romilda, without me getting poisoned twice. Nobody told you to eat those cauldrons, Harry said, taking the book back and flipping through the book with an amused expression on his face. Fred and George bought me a copy for my birthday. Ron shrugged. It just seemed appropriate. Harry looked up and smirked. So you got it for your birthday, and then is this how you tricked Lavender into going to the room of requirement? Ron's face turned magenta and he grabbed the book. I thought we weren't talking about stuff like that. That was all the answer Harry needed. Makes sense now. They spent the rest of the morning bantering. Harry was glad that their spat in the garden a few days before wasn't coming between them now. After all, to do what they were preparing to do, they all needed to be in a good place with each other. After breakfast, Mrs. Weasley presented Harry with the gift from her and author, a gold wizard's watch. I'm sorry it's not new like the one we gave Ron, Mrs. Weasley said, helping Harry fasten the clasp. No, I love it, he assured her, running his fingertips over the slightly scuffed watch. It was my brother Fabian's. He wasn't exactly careful with his things, she said, beaming at Harry. You see, it's tradition to give a wizard his first watch when he comes of age, she explained. Thank you, Mrs. Weasley, Harry said, kissing her on her cheek, causing Molly to tear up. Just Harry, she paused, then looked up at him. Be careful. Harry nodded, always. Hermione was sitting in the floor in Ron's room going through all of their things. She'd been spending as much time as she could getting things ready for their trip. For the life of him, Harry, he wasn't exactly sure how she planned on them carrying everything without drawing too much attention to themselves. Of course, if there was a way Hermione would figure it out, that was one thing in life he could count on. He walked over to where she was at and sat down behind her, pulling her to where she sat between his legs and leaned back against his chest. "You've been at it all day." He kissed the side of her neck, his arms wrapping around her. "We have so much to do and so little time," Hermione said, turning to look up at him. "Not even enough time for you to spend my birthday with me," he teased. "It's oh God, Harry, I completely forgot," she exclaimed, tears forming in her eyes. "I was planning to go with Fred and George to Diagon Alley to pick up your birthday gift. I can't believe I forgot." He kissed her forehead. "Don't worry about it," he said, grinning. "I already know what I want you give me for my birthday." "You can't pick out your own birthday gift," Hermione said. "That takes the fun from it." "I can assure you that this time it will be completely fun and worth it," he said. Hermione blushed a pretty red. "Oh well, I thought that was a given." Harry bit back a laugh. "Well, we can tell where your mind is at," he teased. "Harry," she gasped in shock and hit him on the shoulder playfully. He laughed harder. "You were the one who said it." She turned and looked up at him. "And exactly what is it you're purposing?" "Marriage," Harry said, pulling the small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a very old ring. It had been part of his father's family for generations. The band was goblin-made, brilliant of platinum. There were diamonds that reminded Harry of wings that came up to surround the perfect black pearl in the middle. "All I want for my birthday is for you to agree to be my wife." Hermione sat there, not exactly sure if she was able to make herself form words. After opening her mouth several times only to close it again, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Yes, Harry," she finally said, looking up at him. "Yes." Harry was sure that he'd never had a happier moment. He stood up and pulled her to her feet and wrapped his arms around her and spun her around. "I love you," he said. She laughed. "I love you too. This is crazy, you know." "Not even," he said, pulling the ring from the case and slid it onto her finger where it fit perfectly. "Where did you?" "My vault at Gringotts. It's been passed down to the brides of Potter men. Remus told me the story about it. My dad had told him before he asked my mom," he explained. "It's amazing," she said. "I've never seen anything like it. Potter women aren't traditional. They deserve something unique," Harry explained, taking her hand in his hand, running his thumb over the ring. How are we doing this?" she asked. "After the war," he said. "When this is all over, we're having the grandest wedding you can come up with in that pretty head of yours." "I like that," she said, getting a faraway look. Harry knew what she was thinking, that this moment would be happier if she could share it with her parents. He wished he could tell her that when he'd asked Mr. Granger's permission to marry his daughter that he'd been ecstatic. He knew that she was going to be beyond pissed when he learned what he'd done. He just hoped she'd be able to forgive him. Mrs. Weasley stood in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on the dinner she'd been preparing for Harry's birthday. It hadn't escaped her knowledge that both Harry and Hermione seemed to be glowing, or that on the ring finger of Hermione's left hand was a stunning new addition. She'd always considered Harry one of her own children, and the mother in her was dying to learn all of the details of the proposal. On the other hand, the deaths of Mad Eye and Dumbledore had really taken its toll on her. She was starting to feel helpless. It was a feeling she loathed. As she watched as Ron, Harry, Hermione, and Ginny greeted their guest who'd just arrived, she wondered if she made the right choice when she refused to let Ron, Harry, and Hermione join the order. She wondered if by letting them, it might have kept them from going off and doing whatever they'd been planning for the last few days. Of course they were all so headstrong and refused to tell anyone exactly what they were doing. She had a feeling that Remus and Tonks possibly knew, but if they did, they weren't going to give away too much. She could always forbid them to go, but they were now all of age and Harry and Hermione really weren't her own children. As for Ron, well, you really couldn't force a Weasley to do something. Look at the disastrous relationship they all now had with Percy. He and Arthur weren't even on speaking terms. She wondered if things would ever be good again. To be honest, she couldn't remember when times ever really were completely good. Sure, there were the 11 years of peace between the time that Harry as a baby defeated Voldemort until the time that he made it to Hogwarts. That's really when all this business started up again, and even in that time things really weren't all that peaceful. There was always a sense of dread in the back of all their minds. Everyone knew that he would be back, they just didn't know how or when. With everything that was going on, it made her wonder what was going to happen next. The war had barely begun and already the deaths were so numerous. The deaths of people to Molly were very much like family. She couldn't imagine what would happen if she did lose one of her children, and every time she looked at Ron, Harry, and Hermione she wondered if this would be the last time she saw them alive. She knew that she shouldn't be thinking like this, she had no business thinking like this. When she was alone with her thoughts she couldn't think of anything but what ifs. She wondered what Fleur and Bill's children would be like if they would ever get to have children. If they did, would they grow up and never know their parents? Would Charlie find someone as gentle-hearted as he was, and Percy, would he learn that there was more to life than personal ambition? Would she ever get the chance to reconcile with him? Then there was Fred and George. While she was always the most critical on them, they were also the joy in her life as well. Ron and Ginny were the ones she'd never felt she had to worry about. While they were the ones who found themselves in the most danger at times, she always knew that they would come out safely. Maybe it was because Harry was always there, he'd came between her family and danger more times than she could count. She just hoped that Ginny realized that Dean Thomas wasn't the right man for her. She was brave and strong, she needed someone who wouldn't try to hold her back and tie her down. More than anything, she wondered if Harry would actually get to live. Please like and subscribe.